Wit tells a lot of seemingly apocryphal stories through the course of the Stormlight archive, but if there's one story that I think has the most important implication, it's Derethil and the Wandersail. That's a tale that he first tells all the way back in Way of Kings, but is given new meaning in Wind and Truth. So today, I want to break down the story of Derethil and the Wandersail, not as a myth or a parable, but as instruction. Specifically, I think the story is Wit's biggest gift to Kaladin, giving him the secret and the tools for his most important mission yet, and that's how to restore the legacy of Adonalsium on Roshar. So what I'm going to argue in this video is that this story, the story of Derethil and the Wandersail, isn't just thematic foreshadowing, it's literal encoding. It's Wit embedding a method through both story and song for how Roshar can be remade. And what it shows that if you paid attention, Wit told Kaladin everything he needed to know in Way of Kings. This video will include spoilers for all of the Stormlight archive up until the end of Wind and Truth, and I'll also draw a little bit from the Ars Arcanum. And as a reminder, if you like this kind of content, please like the video and subscribe. You can also become a member of the channel by going to the channel page and hitting join as a member. And that gives you both a way to support my content, but also a way to ask me to do specific video topics. Let's get started. Let's start with the story as we first hear it in Way of Kings. And the context here is really important. This is at the point where Kaladin has almost given up entirely. He's on the verge of killing himself, and he's on the Shattered Plains, and he hears a melody. A melody began playing distantly, carrying over the plains. Kaladin jumped at the sound. It was so unexpected, so out of place, that it was startling despite its softness. He walks towards that sound, and what he sees is Wit playing this melody on his flute. The odd melody he played was alien, almost unreal, like something from another place in time. It echoed down the chasm and came back. It almost sounded like the man was playing a duet with himself. And eventually, Wit begins telling Kaladin the story of Derethil, in conjunction with playing this melody. So let's hear the story. This story is about Derethil and the Wandersail. Derethil is well known in some lands, though I have heard him spoken of less here in the east. He was a king during the Shadow Days, the time before memory. A powerful man, commander of thousands, a leader of tens of thousands, tall, regal, blessed with fair skin and fairer eyes. He was a man to envy. Derethil fought the Voidbringers during the days of the Heralds and the Radiants. When there was finally peace, he found he was not content. His eyes always turned westward towards the great open sea. He commissioned the finest ship men had ever known, a majestic vessel intended to do what none had dared before, sail the seas during a high storm. Derethil's goal was to seek the origin of the Voidbringers, the place where they had been spawned. Many called him a fool, yet he could not hold himself back. He named the vessel the Wandersail and gathered the crew of the bravest of sailors. Then, on a day when a high storm brewed, this ship cast off. Riding out into the ocean, the sail hung wide like arms open to the storm winds. The Wandersail ran aground and was nearly destroyed, but Derethil and most of his sailors survived. They found themselves on a ring of small islands surrounding an enormous whirlpool, where, it is said, the ocean drains. Derethil and his men were greeted by a strange people with long, limber bodies who wore robes of a single color and shells in their hair, unlike any that grow back on Roshar. These people took the survivors in, fed them, and nursed them back to health. During his weeks of recovery, Derethil studied the strange people, who called themselves the Uvara, the people of the great abyss. Hoid then goes on to describe how, even though these people always seem to agree with each other, they actually show no mercy to each other. And he tells a story of how a serving girl dropped something, and the people, the Uvara, basically descended upon her and killed her. And even though these people blame the emperor for why they show no mercy to each other, what Derethil eventually learns is that that emperor is dead. So it's basically the story of how the emperor has no clothes. And the kind of like stated moral of the story might be that basically it forced these people to confront this idea that their actions were their responsibility, that they couldn't blame some sort of like external force for what they were doing themselves. There's a huge amount to break down here. So I'm actually going to start by focusing on 3 kind of overarching points or clues encoded in the story. Those 3 starting points are 1, Wit's use of music to tell the story. 2 is what Derethil was actually seeking, which I think is not entirely clear. And then 3 is what he actually found, like what this Uvara was or what we're talking about here. Let's take those one at a time. First, music as part of the story. And in Universe, the moral, as I just mentioned, is, or at least Kaladin seems to take the moral of the story, is a little bit about like a meditation on responsibility. But what's important here is how the story is told, not just the words that Wit tells, but also his use of music interspersed through it. Over the course, as he's telling the story, the sounds of his flute return back to him. And as we learn in Wind and Truth, that's because that's the wind, that's one of the original Spren of Roshar, returning that melody back to him. And through the course of telling the story, Hoid also decides to give his flute to Kaladin in order for him eventually to learn the same melody that Wit is playing. And so up front, I think that's like a defining feature of Derethil and the Wandersail. The story was delivered through tone and rhythm and melody, which I think shows that it's not just meant to encode like facts, but actually sound as well. The second important foundational point here is to break down what Derethil was actually seeking. Wit tells Kaladin that Derethil's goal was to seek the origin of the Voidbringers, which I think at face value seems to suggest it could be a location like Braze, which is where the fused are remade in some ways. But when Kaladin retells the story to Nail in Wind and Truth, the framing changes, and I think that means a lot. Kaladin says, Derethil and his crew set out to cross the ocean and find out what was on the other side. Some say they sought the place that the Voidbringers were born. Others say, and this is important, others say Derethil sought the origin itself, that mythical place where storms begin and the light is most powerful. That's a big addition, and I think the question is, what is the origin? And I don't think it's Braze. I combed through the books, and what I think the origin is actually referring to is echoes of this untouched Adonalsium from a pre-Shardic era on Roshar. As a reminder, Roshar, as we learned in Wind and Truth, was created by Adonalsium, who kind of imbued or gave it some special focus. And some of the elements on Roshar existed prior to the arrival of the shards, honor, cultivation, or odium. What we also learn is that echoes of that original Roshar still exist on the planet, particularly through the 3 original Spren that were created from Adonalsium's essence. Those are the wind, the stone, and the night. And so when Kaladin refers to Derethil seeking the origin, I think what he's referring to is the origin of Roshar, aka Adonalsium. This idea, I think, is reinforced in different parts of the Stormlight archive. Notably, the singers, when we first meet them or in Dalinar's visions in Wind and Truth, they refer to the origin of songs, which Dalinar surmises is Adonalsium, i.e. the bestower of songs and forms to the singers. Puli, who's a lightkeeper on the east of Roshar that we meet in one of the interludes, he believes a legend that there are men from the hidden of the origin with light in their pockets who would eventually return, which I think sounds very similar to what Kaladin describes as this mythical place where storms begin and the light is most powerful. And actually, speaking of a mythical place where storms begin, Chris, who's a scholar that I think knows probably the most about anything on Roshar, anything in the Cosmere, she posits that the storms on Roshar actually predated the arrival of honor and cultivation in Odium and were actually pre-Shardic in origin, i.e. created by Adonalsium. So all of this, I think, points, for me at least, to this idea that Derethil's goals wasn't to seek praise or anything else on Roshar. It was to seek the origin of where Roshar started, this kind of mythical echoes of Adonalsium. This leads me to the third point, which is, what did he actually find? And I think that he found a part of this origin that he was seeking, but he actually found it embedded within odium's perpendicularity. So bear with me. Wit describes how Derethil and his crew found themselves on islands surrounding this enormous whirlpool. And for Derethil, that just meant a whirlpool. But as Cosmere-aware readers, I think often when there are whirlpools of pools, they could suggest perpendicularities, which are places where the investiture has grown so great that power kind of pools into something that enables people to travel off-world. And so what I think Derethil actually found was this perpendicularity in this pool. And it also, I think, explains why when he talks about the Uvara, they were wearing shells in their hair that you're not seeing in Roshar, suggesting that that perpendicularity led him off-world in some capacity. And with Derethil, I don't think he knew what he found. I think he didn't seem to use the perpendicularity or really understand it. He just survived it. But what's important is that he returned back to Roshar and he told the tale of this perpendicularity to somebody that knew what it was. And so, 3,000 years before the events of the Stormlight Archive, Derethil meets Ishar and tells him what he found. Ishar explains that by that time, Derethil was then so old he could not walk without the help of his grandson, and then told him his tale. Much of it was embellishments, Ishar says, I expect. I've searched for the islands he mentioned, and although my methods are not exhaustive, I could not find them. What this shows to me is that Ishar believed the story enough to investigate it. Derethil encountered the mechanism, Ishar recognized it for what it was, and that recognition, I think, was enough for Ishar to seek it out and actually, unlike what he suggests in this little blurb, to actually exploit it. What we also learned in Wind and Truth is that Ishar found odium's perpendicularity and stepped into the well of control, taking up a piece of odium's power. And to me, that timeline matches. Derethil tells the story to Ishar 3,000 years ago. Ishar finds the well of control 1,000 years ago, which suggests in that 2,000 years, he searched for the story that Derethil found, and eventually that led him to odium's perpendicularity. But what does this have to do with the origin or Adonalsium? And I think this is probably the most controversial step in this argument, but I feel like the text keeps pointing us here. Because what Derethil found and then Ishar exploited was odium's perpendicularity, but it was somehow linked or co-located with the remnants of the origin. To understand that, I think you do have to understand that odium was maintaining his perpendicularity in a different way than other perpendicularities connected to other shards. And in fact, Honor says this. He says something about his pool, the way he was maintaining it, was different. And the biggest giveaway for how it was different is Ba-Ado-Mishram, who herself also found odium's perpendicularity, but the power that it gave her wasn't just relating to odium, it somehow allowed her to connect to Roshar itself and align with the planet and its tones. And so for reasons that I feel like we don't fully understand, odium's perpendicularity and Roshar's origin, or the parts of Roshar that is hidden, are somehow bound together. And so putting it all together, Derethil and the Wandersail is a story about a king that travels seeking the remnants of Adonalsium and then eventually finds a perpendicularity, odium's perpendicularity, which is somehow connected to Roshar and the remnants of Adonalsium, doesn't recognize it for what it is, returns back to Roshar and tells Ishar, one of the heralds, who does figure out what is happening here and takes up and exploits that knowledge. Now I want to return back to this idea of music encoded within the story, or Wit's encoding of music within the story explicitly. Because Wit, as I mentioned, doesn't just tell Kaladin the story, he actually connects it explicitly to a melody and a rhythm, and he gives Kaladin a special flute on which to play that melody and rhythm on. That rhythm is special. Wit says that it's one of the rhythms that guided humans across the void to Roshar. He says they followed it to reach your world. And Syl explicitly confirms this in Wind and Truth as well. She says that rhythm is one of the rhythms of Roshar itself, made into a song with the tones of gods. And then Wit says gods older than yours, implying that it's the tone of the gods older than the shards. So I think what's happening here is that Wit isn't just telling Kaladin a story, he's literally giving him a map and a rhythm with which to refine the original god of Roshar, which is Adonalsium. In fact, he kind of explicitly says this to Kaladin. He says, "This is the journey, Kaladin, the last part of it. Listen to me, I want you to practice with that flute until you make the sound return to you, because that will mean that Roshar is listening." And that's the kind of the quest that he gives Kaladin. He says, get Roshar to listen and heal Ishar. What Kaladin is being asked to do, essentially, is to play the flute, is to master the rhythms of Roshar and align himself with the original parts of Roshar. He's being asked to become someone that Roshar will answer to. And I think that explains why Kaladin's quest is linked up with healing Ishar, because they are two sides of the same coin. By healing Ishar's mind and by coaxing Roshar's original and buried rhythms out, he basically helps align the humans to Roshar. That, I think, is Kaladin's true arc. It's not conquest, it's not fighting, it's not domination, it's alignment. It's restoring resonance and harmony and Roshar's original rhythms back to Roshar. And that in turn is a true meaning of Derethil on the Wandersail and Wit's gift to Kaladin. Okay, yeah, so would love to hear what you think of all of this theory in the comments below. And as I mentioned, if you like this kind of content, please subscribe, but also you can join the channel. And I love Wit stories. I think they always have hidden meanings, and Derethil and Wandersail is the one that I think has the most hidden meaning right now. So thanks everyone. Thank you for watching.